two chapters are about two what we call market structures. So there's different kinds of markets that you can participate in, and they're differentiated by how much competition there is in the market. And so we're going to look at the two extreme ends, perfect competition, which means lots and lots and lots of competition, and then the last chapter is a monopoly, when there is no competition. Right? Now, what's the difference? Well, first of all, for the consumer, there's a big difference. Right? What will a monopolist do compared to someone who faces competition? What would a monopolist do? Higher prices, that's right. So for a consumer, facing a monopolist is not good because they will charge higher prices, and also the consumer just has no choice, right? If there's a monopolist, then there's only one firm selling the good. But when there's a lot of competition, it means that the consumer has lots of choices. And when the consumer has lots of choices, then their demand is more elastic, right? They're more sensitive about the price because they have many other options. Right? With a monopolist, a consumer will not have any other options. And so if the monopolist charges a higher price and the consumer wants the good, they'll just have to pay the higher price. But when there's competition and lots of other firms all supplying the same good or a similar good, then the consumer can be more picky about the price and try to get the lowest priced good. Okay, so perfect competition means just lots and lots and lots of competition. Now, as the seller, okay, so as a consumer, you would rather be buying the good in a perfectly competitive market. You'll get a lower price and you have lots of other options. But as a seller, do you want to sell in a perfectly competitive market? No, because you've got all those competitors all charging low prices, and you will also then have to charge a low price. So as a seller, you'd way rather be a monopolist, if you could be. Okay. All right, so perfect competition is what we're doing in Chapter 12. So this is when there's lots and lots and lots of producers, and in perfect competition, they are all selling exactly the same thing. Okay, so for example, around here, there's lots of blueberry production, right? Lots of blueberry production. All the blueberries are the same, right? Whether you get the blueberries from this farm or you get the blueberries from this farm, the blueberries are exactly the same. So as a consumer, because the blueberries from different farms are exactly the same, what's the only thing that you care about? The price, that's right. And if one farmer is trying to charge a higher price for his or her blueberries compared to all the other farmers, is anybody going to buy the blueberries? No, because the exact same blueberries are available from the other farmers at the lower price. So in this kind of a market then, the consumer, it's good for the consumer. The consumer will buy the good from the sellers with the lowest price. And if there is a seller who tries to charge a higher price, they just won't be able to sell anything. Okay, all right, so consumers know that the same good is available from other sellers for the low price. Okay, so if one firm tries to increase the price of its good, it will not be able to sell anything. All right, so the kinds of examples that we'll be talking about in this chapter are going to be things like food, like unprocessed food, right? Like just plain fruits and vegetables or grains, and other things like natural resources. And what they have in common is that when producers produce them, they will be producing exactly the same thing, right? Different blueberry farmers produce the same blueberries. Different growers of different kinds of rice will be producing the same rice. Say Canadian wood versus American wood, it's exactly the same. All right, so what this means for the seller then is they have to charge the same price as all the other sellers. And so we use the term price takers. Okay, so the firms will be price takers. So they have to take the market prices given, they cannot determine their own price. And consumers are also price takers, right? Like when you want to buy blueberries, you can't negotiate because there are also lots and lots of consumers buying the goods. So you can't go to a blueberry farm and try to negotiate a lower price. They'll just say no. All right. Okay, so now for the diagrams in the chapter, we will be looking at two different diagrams. One of the diagrams is the market. There we go. Okay, so one of the diagrams is the market. So this is going to be, this supply curve here is the total supply, like market supply, right? So the graph is showing the market. So this supply curve is the total supply for all the suppliers. And so just like in chapter 3, this market equilibrium is going to be what determines the price. All right, so for this good, the market price is 10. Now for an individual firm, they have to charge the market price then. So we just draw this line over here. So 10 would be the market price. So that is the price that the consumers are willing to pay. And so what we can draw here then is a horizontal line which will represent the demand curve. So demand is perfectly elastic then for an individual firm. Okay, so the difference here is we have a downward sloping demand curve or a perfectly elastic demand curve. The perfectly elastic demand curve is just for one firm because we know that for any one firm in the market, they can't charge a higher price. If they tried to charge a higher price, consumers would buy nothing. So for an individual firm, you have to charge the same price whether you're going to produce a little bit of the good or whether you're going to produce a lot of the good. You have to charge the same price. Okay. So say another example is my mom and dad had an apple orchard. And so they would charge, they wouldn't even use the word charge. They would just take the apples to the packing house. They would pay them a certain price, and they had no control whatsoever over that price. They just got paid the market price for apples. Now, the market price for apples, as with any of the other examples, might fluctuate if the market equilibrium fluctuates. So if there were a change in the supply, that would change the market price. Or if there was a change in the demand in the market, that would change the market price. But whatever that market price is, that is the price that the individual seller has to take. They have no control over it at all. All right. Okay, so this demand curve is perfectly elastic. So that's here. Okay, so the individual firm demand is perfectly elastic. So that will be perfectly elastic at the price. So this demand curve is also the same as the price, and that will also be the same as the marginal revenue. Marginal revenue. So that was, you guys learned about that in chapter 9. So that is just the extra revenue per unit of the good. All right, so here in the table we've got the price, which is constant. Doesn't matter what quantity the seller is selling, they get paid that price. Total revenue, just price times quantity, so 10 times 5, 10 times 6, and so on. And then the marginal revenue, each time they sell one more unit, they're getting an extra $10, right? From 50 to 60 is an extra $10. From 60 to 70 is an extra $10. Right? So the marginal revenue is the same as the price then, because the price is constant. So the marginal revenue would be constant. Good. Okay. Good. Okay, any questions so far? All right. So basically, this chapter is going to be all about why you don't want to be a farmer. Okay, now we're going to look at the two graphs again. All right, so starting with the perspective of an individual firm. So when we're drawing the graph for an individual firm, demand is a horizontal line, right? Price is fixed. Okay, so the demand curve that an individual firm faces is, again, perfectly elastic. And what that means is if the individual firm changes their supply, so let's say one blueberry farmer gets sick or retires or something, and it's just one blueberry farmer, then their supply will change. So let's say they get sick and they can't work as much, so then their supply will decrease. That's not going to change the market price of blueberries because it's just one blueberry farmer. So the price would stay the same. The only thing that would be changing is for that one individual farmer, their quantity would decrease. Now notice we're using a lowercase q here, just indicating that it's one firm, not the total quantity in the market. All right, so these supply curves here, I'll just make a note. These supply curves are individual supply curves, right? They're for an individual firm. Good. Okay. So the other diagram shows the market. So the difference is that when we draw the diagram for the market, the supply and demand curves represent the total, all the producers, all the consumers. So then we draw the demand curve as downward sloping. And the reason why we're drawing it as downward sloping is because when the market supply changes, that will change the price. So for example, let's say there's something happens like frost or drought or something that affects all the blueberry farmers, and all of them have a decrease in their crop. Okay, so then the market supply will decrease. That's going to drive the price up. That's different from one blueberry farmer getting sick, because that would be one blueberry farmer out of hundreds or thousands of blueberry farmers. It's not a significant enough change to affect the price in the market at all. But if something happens to all the blueberry farmers, like bad weather that would affect all of them at the same time, that's going to drive the price up because there's less blueberries in the market. So we have to show the demand curve is downward sloping then so that we can illustrate that price change. All right, so the demand curve is downward sloping because when the supply of all the producers, I'll highlight the word all. So when the supply of all the producers changes at once, the price and quantity in the market will change. Okay, so for example, if supply decreases in the market, then with the downward sloping demand curve, we are able to illustrate how that will push the price up. All right, so these supply curves here are market supply curves. right, any questions so far? Good, all right. So, characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. It has to be that all the firms are selling exactly the same thing, exactly the same thing. So therefore, each individual firm cannot charge any higher of a price. They have to charge exactly the same price as all the other competitors. All right, so there's different words that we can use to describe this, the fact that they're all selling the same thing. The good is what we can call a standardized product. We can call it a commodity, or we can use the term perfect substitutes. So for the consumer, one blueberry compared to the other blueberry, they're exactly the same. So they're perfectly substitutable. All right, so for the consumer, this is fantastic. You've got lots of choice. You can buy from any different producer, and you will just pick the one with the lowest price. So that is because you can't tell the difference between one producer's product and another producer's product. So as long as the consumers cannot tell the difference, they will not pay any more. The only way to be able to charge a higher price is if you can somehow make your good different in some way. So say with blueberry farmers, you might notice that some farms say that they're either organic or say no spray, which is sort of mostly organic. Anyway, so why do they do that? Because they want to charge more money, right? So if the blueberries are somehow different, like they're organic, then consumers will pay more money for them, right? And so that's why producers would want to do that. Or you develop, or I should say process your product in some way, right? Like instead of just having blueberries, you could somehow process the blueberries into whatever, juice, jam, whatever it is. And then you can also charge more money because then you're making a product that's slightly different from what the other firms are selling. Okay, and then what's the best is if you can develop a brand name. So why do companies spend so much money developing a brand name? To make it so that consumers, make it so that consumers will pay more money. All right, so producers try to develop brand names for like clothing or cars, and it's partly to sort of convince consumers that their brands are better, and then therefore consumers are willing to pay more for them. Okay, all right, so like those kinds of things with clothing or cars, the markets that they're sold in are competitive for sure, because there's lots of firms selling clothing, there's lots of firms selling cars. It's just that it's not a perfectly competitive market. Perfectly competitive means that the consumer cannot differentiate your good from another one. So these goods, obviously, you can differentiate, and consumers are willing to pay different prices for the different brand names. So these kind of markets for branded goods are competitive. They're just not perfectly competitive. So if you go on in economics, then at the higher level micro courses, you would study these different types of market structures. So those kind of markets would be what we call monopolistic competition. So each brand name has a monopoly over their brand name and their products, but then they're competing with other people with different brand names. But anyway, so for this class, we're not talking about those kinds of goods. We're going to be talking about more simple examples like blueberries or natural resources. All right, okay, so we're talking about what makes a market perfectly competitive. Okay, so perfect substitutes. Next thing is that no one producer has a large market share. So what that means is that you have a lot of firms, but they're all small firms. There's no giant firm that dominates the market. Okay, so for grain production in Canada, for example, there's no giant firm that makes a large percent of the production. Okay, so that would be a perfectly competitive market. But breakfast cereals, competitive, but not a perfectly competitive market. First of all, because definitely you can differentiate between the different cereals and you're willing to pay more for certain cereals compared to other cereals. But also because we have the one company in North America that dominates the market. All right, so there has to be a lot of producers. One of the reasons for this is that if there is a company that is very, very large, then there can be some not fair business practices. So for example, in Canada's airline industry, we have some big firms, right, like Air Canada and WestJet. And then we have little firms that try and enter the market, like, you know, the little cheap ones, like there was Swoop, and then, I can't remember, I don't know, it's always changing, right? There's always these little firms that are cheaper and they're trying to enter the market. But then what happens is because WestJet and Air Canada have so much capital and they already have, you know, such a big share of the market, is that they will drive down their own prices temporarily and then try to get the new cheaper firms to sort of not succeed. So we don't want that to happen. That's not fair business practices, and it doesn't lead to more competition, it leads to less competition. All right, so last thing is that it has to be very easy for new firms to enter the market and start selling the good, right? That's what will make it competitive. It's very easy for competitors to enter the market. Oops. Okay, so firms can easily close down or start up. Okay, so that is called free entry and exit. Firms can easily close down or start up. And so that is what will guarantee competition. So for blueberries, really anybody who wanted to could get a blueberry bush and grow some blueberries. You might not be good at it, you might not make any money, but you could do it, right? It's a very easy thing to do. But there's other markets where you would not be able to do that. So milk, for example, in Chapter 5, we talked about milk and how in Canada the market is governed by a quota system. So you are allowed to buy a blueberry bush and start selling blueberries, but you're not allowed to just get a cow and start selling milk, right? You have to have that quota license. So that means that the milk market is definitely not perfectly competitive then. Okay, so there has to be no obstacles. So example, government regulations for, say, milk. And then another example I put here is high startup or shutdown costs. And for that, I put computers. Right? So something like computers, cars, pharmaceutical companies, there's a huge amount of money that would go into developing a product. And so that is an obstacle. Right? It's not like blueberries. Blueberry bushes, a little baby one, only costs a few dollars. But for other kinds of complicated goods, it's just too expensive for most people to enter the market. All right, any questions? Yes?
So why aren't there any, like, why isn't the high scientific cost not an obstacle?
No, it is an obstacle.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. So the startup cost would be an obstacle.
Because would this be for like a firm trying to enter?
That's right, yeah. Right, so if you wanted to grow blueberries, it only costs a few dollars. Pretty much everybody could afford to do that. But if you wanted to start making computers, you would need a huge amount of capital, which most people wouldn't be able to get. All right, okay, so we will be talking in this chapter then about more simple examples where it's easy to start producing the good.